I am Michael D. Campbell. I'm chairman of the Uranium Committee of the Energy Minerals Division of the AAPG. I'm also chief geologist and hydrogeologist of I2M Consulting here in Houston, Texas. I'll be talking today about the fact that uranium and nuclear power are on the move. Over the past few years, new activities are developing in nuclear power and also in the future demands. And so we're going to be discussing these in some detail in the next few minutes. But right now, I want to introduce my committee in some detail, and then we'll pick up the technical discussions shortly thereafter. The role of the Uranium Committee within the AAPG. Well, it's to monitor and evaluate and report on the uranium activities in the U.S. and the world for the purpose of advising the AAPG membership and the general public on the energy sources that compete with oil and gas in the generation of electricity in the U.S. and around the world. It's also a basis for uranium exploration and mine development, which depends on nuclear power and to fuel and generate electricity. So we monitor both industries and look for developments and record developments. And we generate annual reports each year that are prepared by the committee, and I of course lead that effort. And it's supported by vice chairs and advisory groups and special consultants from time to time. The UCOM members also contribute to other publications that you will see perhaps referenced in this or some of our other publications. The UCOM members also provide input to the I2M web portal that we draw on quite a lot for building up information from various sources, be that reports that come out, technical news items, and what have you. So let's have a look at the Uranium Committee content. Thank you. This will show you the layout of the committee. As you can see, I have three vice chairs that support me, and they're primarily from different aspects of uranium. For instance, Henry Wise represents the industrial aspects. Stephen Sabray represents the university aspects of uranium and associated issues. And Bob Gregory represents the government research and related aspects. As you can see also, we have a rather large advisory group. Let me remind you that this particular presentation will also be made available in the PDF form so that you can have access to the various links and references that we've included in this presentation. Having said that, let's look at some of the issues really involved. On the right here, you'll see a fair number of points about the generation of electricity and some history of what happened. And yes, it's in small print, so it's more designed for you to read later. I'm not going to discuss it in any detail, except to point out that over the years, nuclear power has shown itself to be resilient. It has come through a number of incidents like 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl and Fukushima, and all those have taught the nuclear power industry to how to handle such things, that incidents that will come up. And if you note, on most of those issues, no one died, no one was killed, no one was irradiated. So again, the industry has learned how to handle meltdowns, contrary to what the China syndrome with that movie, if you remember, many years ago, said that if we had a meltdown, it would irradiate most of California. Well, that's the media for you, and Hollywood especially. But what it didn't help is a few weeks after that movie was released, that's when 3 Mile Island occurred. So that sort of seared into the public mind, and the media jumped all over it because they'd never had to deal with that before. So no wonder. I remember myself wondering seriously about, well, does nuclear power have a role to play in the 70s? And I, as you know, or may know, I worked for a number of uranium exploration companies in the 70s, and so I was looking at it from that point of view. But anyway, the point is, the issues have resolved. Nuclear power is building again, and I'll discuss some of these issues as we get along. But does nuclear power have a greater role in the energy solution? The UCOM committee deals with those things a lot. One of the things that we come up with all the time is the safety issues. When you compare the operation of some 40 or 50 years now of nuclear power plants, and you compare their safety records, it doesn't compare at all with any of the other major energy groups from day to day, year to year records and what have you. And it does. Nuclear power does compete with other energy sources, but it's all in a matter of perspective. So the other issue, of course, that keeps coming up, and as it should, is that nuclear power is indeed friendly. One of the issues with nuclear power is what to do with the waste. But for the past number of years, since the 80s, in fact, nuclear waste has been stored on site. Contrary to what the federal government was supposed to do by law, by the way, that they were supposed to provide a site for storage. Storage, not disposal, because in storage we may use that material again. So if you ever wondered why we just didn't get rid of it, that is why. Of course, you've probably heard about the Yucca Mountain facility in Nevada. That costs billions and billions of dollars. And then after a lot of geological evaluations, someone decided that the rhyolite that the particular facility is built into is too leaky and threatens groundwater over 10,000 years, or whatever number they used along those lines. So we have to remember that yes, the waste is around, but there hasn't been any problem. You can see in the storage casks that they're solid, and they'll do until our government decides how they really want to have it. It's not a matter of technical, it's a matter of political, once again. At the end of 2019, there was 441 operational nuclear power plants in this world, and there are many more to come. Let's look over here on the left-hand side of the graph, or of the page over here. You'll see the history of reactor startups and the closures in the world in the brown down here. The startups are the blue. You can see during the 1980s and 85, you can almost spot where the incidents occurred. For example, in the latter part of 1970s, where 3 Mile Island occurred, there was a decrease. And then again, after Chernobyl, there was a major decrease in the number of power plants that were constructed in this world, and especially in the United States, where we didn't build another nuclear power plant until a few years ago. And there are 2 nuclear power reactors coming online in Georgia and South Carolina, power groups coming on here pretty soon. So that's something new. Will there be enough reactors in the world to cover the areas that we need? Well, remains to be seen, actually. We'll have to see. The new technology coming on that we'll talk about in a little bit may help meet that. I seriously doubt if many large-scale plants in this country will occur, but you never can tell. It's all politically and otherwise driven, and certainly not technical. We must say here that over the years, the committee has noticed that the Energy Information Agency, the U.S. government's Energy Information Agency, has been pushing renewables to the extent that I raised the issue with the EIA people about why they weren't covering nuclear power and other fuel related aspects over the years, and eventually they started to pump up some of the information that was coming out, and now it's pretty robust. And so that put us on alert to look for what's going on in renewables, and we found some interesting things. There's apparent, we think there's an inherent flaw in the economics of wind and solar projects that have popped up over the last few years because they keep overlooking and underestimating the operation and maintenance costs of both the wind and the solar large projects. We're not talking about domestic solar or anything like that. We're talking about these large solar and wind projects. The O&M costs just have been underestimated, and therefore the costs to the consumer of energy being produced by the wind and solar sources are starting to go up drastically. That's occurring in Germany, and they're finding out that cost is going up large scale as well. So let's move on here to some other issues. The cost of nuclear energy, as we show over here on the left-hand side, those are coming down with the onset of the small modular reactors that will be here in the next, certainly within the next decade. And the cost of nuclear energy is going down because they're learning, even in the large plants, how to minimize costs and be more competitive with renewables. One thing we noticed with respect to the EIA is, if you look at this graph on the lower right here, you'll see that this is the EIA's projection of what's to come. The projection was made in 2016 when we first noticed the EIA's emphasis on renewables. And you notice that right in here, where we are right now, that's a crossover between the amount of power produced by renewables and the amount of power produced by nuclear power is crossing over and meeting. And we are definitely suspicious of these numbers. This little hook here, you can see maybe the onset of the realization that the O&M costs are higher than what they were earlier anticipated. So, and if you notice that this parallel here means, to us anyway, that renewables really can't exist without the support of natural gas or another grid producing source of energy such as nuclear power. So I'm thinking that we need to keep our eyes on these relationships and go from there. Let's move on to the next slide. Small modular reactors are now under development by hundreds of companies in this country and in Canada and elsewhere. And these units are designed to power small towns or even a neighborhood. You'll see a lot of these installations, I have a feeling, at a lot of these utility transformer sites you see around town. I suspect you're going to see a lot of these showing up as installing nearby. Now, they're reasonable cost to install. They're extremely reasonable waste handling aspects. The fuels are replaced every 5 or 6 years, whatever it is. And rapid construction, you'll see that they're small enough to cart around on the street and bring it to wherever it needs to go. And the installation would be small, not all that large. You can see here is a rendition of what's to come. And it's safe to operate in and even during refueling. This small nuclear technology is going to join the large technology, meaning we're going to keep the old plants because we've got 80 or 90 of those 90 some reactors, even though some of them are going to be retired over the next 10 or 15 years. I suspect that these what we call smears, SMRs, are going to replace a lot of the power needs that the larger, older plants that will be retired have taken over. So these plants are modular, meaning that you can put one plant or one unit or put a series of units next to one another, and depending on how much power you actually need for a particular area. Again, we've included here the history of SMR development and a link, and I would encourage you to have a look at that. Okay, let's move on to the next. Okay, let's look at where our uranium comes from to fuel our 90 some nuclear reactors in the U.S. In the past, it's come from Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Russia, Australia, and Canada. That's a long time back in the early to mid 90s. But that has recently come under some criticism because we're leaning on some pretty unreliable sources of uranium. So you'll notice that maybe you've heard in the news or over the past couple of years, the American mining company decided to raise some cane about overseas importing of uranium, and they're getting some traction now with the current government, oddly enough, and we'll see how that works out. But the fact is, we do need a lot of uranium to run our 98 some reactors, and although those numbers will decline a little bit over the next few years, so there's still a lot of uranium. But where is it in this country? Well, in this country, you can see over here in this map down here that the uranium occurrences are rather widespread. And let me, before I forget it over here, you see this Coles Hill site, and right over here, if you can see my pointer, that is, over here in Virginia, that's a very large uranium deposit in igneous metamorphic rocks. And the trouble is the locals are afraid of uranium mining, even though Duke Power and other nuclear power plants have a number of nuclear power plants in Virginia. The locals have convinced the governor and others in the past to not allow uranium mining, if you can imagine that. But the fact is, that's the way it is. So, but you'll see down here in Texas, there's a lot of trends. As you probably know, I worked in Texas uranium fields in the 70s until 3 Mile Island happened anyway. And then you'll see Wyoming is a major producer. New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Arizona, they're all major deposits, and with different types of uranium, mostly roll fronts, however, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But then also we got uranium up here in the Bocan Mountains, and here I've outlined or showing where the deposit we've been working on over the years in the Seward Peninsula is in hard rocks, but we'll talk about that later too. Okay, what is the government doing? Well, they're thinking about coming up with a plan where we have a strategic petroleum reserve-like plan where uranium reserves will be set aside for uranium producers, a certain percentage, and it's that percentage that the industry is dealing with and trying to get as much as possible so that we're not relying on insecure overseas supplies. Canada and Australia should be our partners, and they are for a long time and will remain so, because Canada has just an incredible amount of very high grade uranium, and Australia has a lot as well, in a couple of types that we'll discuss later. And we'll have some more discussions about this in a little bit, so let's go on to the next slide. Okay. The U.S. has a lot of uranium in the ground. Most of it is in the form of what we call roll front deposits, where they form in aquifer systems. Naturally, they're not introduced, and when they're cleaned up, there's very little evidence that any damage has been done to the aquifer. I'll show you here, this is a drilling site, and there has to be some pretty closely spaced drilling to let's say, figure out where exactly to start putting the injection wells and withdrawal wells. This can, many holes are drilled. You can see the samples over here, and if you notice, it's not just, these are usually in sand and silts and clays, but if you notice, there's differences in oxidation levels, and that will be reflected in a slide coming up. Here's one of the major uranium companies that have adopted the satellite approach to having a centralized processing plant to create yellow cake, and then bring in what they call pregnant solutions from their various in situ mining operations around Texas. This is for the UEC uranium group. Down here is Alta Mesa, is a project I worked on a few years ago, and Energy Fuels now has it, and it's an interesting project, and I would encourage you to, if you're really interested, you might look up in some of my references about 2013, 2014 period. You'll see a big report on this area if you're interested. Now, keep in mind that as I said, there's a lot of uranium around the United States, and we've gathered up the central references for your benefit, again, to be used in the PDF version for looking at the known deposits in Texas, Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico, South Dakota, Nebraska, Colorado, Virginia, and Alaska. So if you want to follow up on that, it's fine. There's many that are roll fronts, but there are also other types of uranium occurrences in the United States. This is on the left here, this is an exposure in one of the one of the open pits that they used to operate many years ago. This is from a publication that we put together in 1977, but a lot of the material is still extremely useful, and that's nice to see, because there hadn't been much work done. In fact, there's something called when 3 Mile Island and then Chernobyl occurred, that brought the uranium exploration to a halt, an absolute halt. Everybody in the field all got laid off, and I have all sorts of stories about that one day. If you want to talk to me the next time we have a conference that we speak face to face rather than in this format, I'll tell you a few stories about that. But getting back to what a roll front, this is a roll front uranium deposit here, and it's just obvious why they call it that way, because uranium forms in a biochemical cell. Here moves very slowly down the dip. This is again in an aquifer, now exposed in this pit, of course. But around that particular zone is also formed other mineralized zones that are rich in selenium, the red material here, and in the dark blue down in here somewhere. Yeah, there it is. You can see, and I'll have a better picture later for you. But it's a geochemical cell, and it's fascinating when you get looking at it from a detailed point of view. This is something that one of my associates put together many years ago when we worked together at Teton Exploration. Bruce Rubin put this little graph together so we could tell when we're drilling holes where we were and whether we go up dip or down dip or left or right to try to get this material right in here where the highest grade material is, and that's where the in situ mining would occur. The characteristic geophysical gamma log shows here, and that too is distinctive and helps you guide. The geological aspects provide guides as well. So the whole subject of uranium exploration and roll fronts is quite interesting and well understood now. On other types, for example, in carbonatites or porphyrin igneous rocks, that's not so much the case. Things are a little more complex, and especially also there's something called the unconformity related uranium. That this shows down here that it's as it says, it's at or near an unconformity between two different kinds of rocks. For example, in the Athabasca Basin, the main sandstone sitting right on top of the basement, and for reasons that we're not really all that sure as to the actual source, you can tell that these very large deposits, some of the higher grade material I was telling you about earlier, occur in some of these particular deposits here. Okay, we need to talk a little bit about the price history of uranium, and because the financial health of the uranium industry depends on it. The graph up in this upper left-hand side here, you can see the real dollar value of uranium, well, yellow cake spot price, I think, is shown here, and you'll see that the price is highly variable throughout the entire history, and it's interesting to note that you can see right about here is 3 Mile Island, and you see the precipitous price drop that happened after that, and then once you get down into the 40s and 50s, that's when Chernobyl came about. It went down further, and then it bumped along for a while. Here you can see it in the $20 zone, and keep in mind that the new in situ mines, well, the relatively new in situ mines, starting in the 60s, of course, require $50 or $60 a pound to be economic. The open pit mines can produce uranium and yellow cake at a much lower price. But the fact is, up until about 2002, the price remained pretty low, and then the nuclear power plants started needing more and more as the supplies ran out, and we had another uptick. But then, sure enough, a few years later, here comes Fukushima, and the price dropped off about 60%. Shortly thereafter, and has been in the let's say low for a long time. Now, keep in mind, we've been getting the uranium from overseas, as you've heard before. Earlier, and it hasn't been all that secure. But the fact is, they can mine uranium at a lot lower price because they have government support to offset some of their costs, and that's why the U.S. Uranium industry got a little, let's say, testy over why we shouldn't be using American uranium. But as you can see here, the price was in the neighborhood of $30 and has been going down ever since, and back into the 20s here in the late 2016, and bumped around a little bit. And this shows what the industry was doing. The Kazakhstan mines were shutting down, turning off about 20% of their production, primarily to keep the price up for later times. And Cameco suspended production at their McArthur River in Canada, their McArthur River facility, and other places around the world start cutting back because either they couldn't produce it, or they didn't want to produce it at such a low price because their profit would be extremely low. So they just wait till later, and hopefully the price will go back up in their thinking. And then, of course, as you know, well, as you may not know, it was sometime around the early 20s, after our problems started with the pandemic, and I don't think they're related, but you never can tell, and history will comment on that, I'm sure. But you can see here the price going up taking a big tick up, and it's expected to keep going up as the nuclear power plants around the country and around the world, and as their numbers increase, are going to require more and more yellow cake and uranium for fuel. One of the things I want to mention at this point is that over the years, there's always been seemingly, starting with the problems at Chernobyl and before that at 3 Mile, and as you probably already heard, after 3 Mile came that movie that talked about irradiating all of California, thanks to Jane Fonda's input on that. Of course, she was an actress and she just was reading her script. But the fact is, you get the feeling she also believed that. But that's another issue. But there's been a lot of opposition from smaller groups and from groups that are funded by renewable energies. We found out we're funding people going on in the country opposing nuclear power without really revealing that they were actually supporting renewables, wind and solar. And we decided, the committee decided at some point a number of years ago to start taking issue with some of these papers and reports that were coming out. And so you can see here in this history link, that will provide you a paper we prepared a few years ago to give you some background on what we do in that regard. This next point here, I want to make a special point. I want to make a special issue out of, and that is a number of years ago, I don't remember how many now, but the subject of the ownership of U.S. uranium reserves came up in a political sense. And there was claims made that 20% of the total U.S. uranium reserves were owned by Russia. It was a political giveaway supposedly, as claimed. And we decided to look into that in some detail and prepared a paper on it, and found out and determined that that was not the case. It was false, patently false, and exaggeration. And whoever started that is probably wishing they hadn't by now. But the fact is, it is shown not to be true. And for details, just check out this paper right here, and you'll get our drift. The Russian company under Uranium One does have widespread interests, but they're nowhere close to owning 20% of U.S. uranium, and they have some operations. And one of the ongoing mines uranium mines in this country, in Wyoming, is a Russian-owned operation, or at least a good percentage, if not all. And they can operate because they don't have to worry about the profitability, because the government supports them. We'll see how long that lasts. So, in closing, let me say that the price history, or the price of uranium, guides where we are in the industry, and as the nuclear power plants increase in number, even the smaller ones, the uranium price should creep up, especially in nuclear power plants, now that we are feeling quite comfortable. We know how to handle meltdowns, which has been done quite well over the years, because the safety record of nuclear power is outstanding. So on that basis, let's go to the next slide and begin to sum up this thing. So in conclusion, let me sort of bring a few issues into final focus for you. Uranium will be needed to fuel nuclear power plants, that is, until fusion power arrives. Now, when will that be? It's difficult to say. There's lots of activity going on in research and development for fusion power, as you may or may not know. And so it could be 10 years, 15, 20 years, as much as 50 years until we have a viable fusion power plant, if ever. So we're going to deal with fissionable power plants now for some time, I suspect. But as long as the nuclear power industry maintains their safety record and the ability to handle such things as widespread issues that affect people, such as meltdowns, which they've learned to do, because no one has died, no one has been injured. Now, Chernobyl was an entirely different issue. That was a Soviet era issue that the West had been warning the Soviet Union for years about that design, and that system sort of resulted because of the Cold War and the Soviet Union's need to depend or to compete with the rest of us and cause trouble. Of course, you realize, of course, although 25 men and women died and a number of children got thyroid cancer, 90-some% of those were cured, and it's unfortunate, of course, a few died. But the fact is, that period is over, and those designs are no longer used, and the emphasis on safety. Now, any particular deposit that we develop depends on the economics, and that depends on the price of yellow cake and related, and the local support. The local support, if you remember, we mentioned about Virginia. They're sitting on a world-class uranium deposit. There's no reason that should not be developed. It has been shown many times that it would not impact the local groundwater, because the groundwater around the mine, and well, a mine to be produced, is already contaminated with natural contamination from that deposit. But the fact is, they don't understand that, and so I suspect sooner or later that deposit will be developed, and will be the better for it. Now, it also depends on state and federal support for nuclear power. In Germany, if you remember some of the news, they decided after Fukushima that nuclear power was not for them, and boy, they started turning off their nuclear plants almost as fast as they could, as they tried to build up their renewable energy and open them and continue to burn their brown. They're what's called brown coal, which is even a higher, a lower quality than lignite that we mine here in Texas, which creates issues. But the fact is, as Germany has gone along over the past few years, they're having trouble getting the power out of their nuclear or out of their renewable energy projects, both wind and solar, that they've had installed in the meantime. And they're starting to wonder where they're going to get the power. Of course, now that they need more power, they're starting to turn to Russia for more natural gas, and we'll see how that goes. But the fact is, I think Germany is in the process of starting to revisiting their decision to move out of nuclear, because let's face it, German engineering is quite good. And has always been, and so I suspect that we're going to be hearing some news about how Germany's turning around and going back to nuclear as they should, in our opinion. Also, Japan, after their devastating earthquake and tsunami that damaged a few of the plants along the coast where the tsunami hit. They went through a period of turning off all their nuclear power plants, or most of them, as far as I know, and to put them through rigorous safety tests and try to, especially those built along the coast, to try to anticipate any future issues of power losses at these power plants because of tsunamis overrunning their systems. And so far, most of their plants have come back online or in the process of coming back on. Of course, a few of them won't because they failed some of the basic safety tests. For example, for siting, some of those, one or two of those plants are sited practically astride some major fault zones, which was overlooked by some of the earlier geologists that have some responsibility for those sightings. But you know, sometimes that will happen if those faults aren't always that obvious. But anyway, the industry will be able to fuel the nuclear power plants in the U.S. And the idea that we don't have enough fuel to run our plants is not true. That's a gross exaggeration. And again, it depends on the cost to mine and to produce the fuel. But if we can't come up with it with our American mining uranium mining companies, then Canada and Australia certainly will. They have outstanding projects and other related issues necessary for supplying whatever fuel needed for American nuclear power plants. Now, in an associated subject, with all this new activity of new power plants and new types of reactors, there's a certain amount of activity and increased employment coming along here in some surprising sources, essentially for the geoscience field. So we've included some links here and we monitor the employment issues for the fields we cover in the I2M web portal, and we've noticed that there's a lot of activity for new activity now coming for geothermal and in some mining areas and in some uranium activities. But what surprises us all is the new activity by NASA and the aerospace industry, which are beginning to look for geologists. Now, this is understandable because if you happen to notice a lot of the new off-world equipment that's roaming around in Mars, you'll notice how outstanding those photographs are. In fact, they're so good that you can it's almost like standing in front of an outcrop, and you want to reach out and grab a piece and whack it with a hammer to see inside what rock type is going on. But you can see some of the structural features of unconformities, angular unconformities, cross bedding, and what have you. Plus the equipment they have are starting to drill holes and take samples, report some spectral data that it gives you some idea of what that particular piece or sampling zone may be. So they're saying they're going to be needing more and more geoscience people. So I would look into that either as you come out of school, or if you're out of the oil and gas industry, you might want to take a look there too, because with your experience and knowledge, you would make a great addition to the aerospace and to NASA programs. So we indicated some links here for you to check out on that basis. But buckle up, because you're going to have to touch all the bases, and you run the numbers, and eventually you will prevail because you've got outstanding experience to make your contribution. Okay, UCOM, in closing, UCOM has a lot of information in their websites, and I would encourage you to look there. There's a link on this for those of you who get the PDF version of this, so you can actually use the links here. But also on the I2M web portal, it's heavily weighted for uranium and thorium and rare earths. And by the way, the reason our committee covers not only nuclear but also thorium and uranium, thorium and rare earths, is because the rare earths and thorium are often associated with the occurrences of uranium. And so that's why it's a good fit for our committee. And we cover that in some detail. And at the same time, during this particular period for this conference, our committee has also produced a presentation on rare earth elements, rare earth deposits around the world, in the U.S. and around the world, and I would recommend you have a look at that. If you can find it, if you can't, let me know. I'll get you a copy of that. And there are two versions, a short version and a long version, so I'll make that known to you as well. So let me close here by saying, take a look at the links that we provided in this presentation for your backup and for additional work. And so on that basis, let me close by saying I hope you had a good conference. And if you have any questions, feel free to call me, send me an email, whatever. I'll be glad to talk to you about employment issues that are prevalent in our field today from our point of view, and about any of the projects that you might have or you might want to know about ours. So I look forward to seeing you again someday. Thank you. As a postscript, here's a list of selected references that we cited and discussed in the presentation for those of you who get the PDF version of this presentation. Thank you.